what is the product? What is the product? What is the business? Who am I? Who are we? What kind of a thing are we trying to do? There's all these high level, semi emotional questions that can't be decided by an AI or really can't be decided by any external entity. Like, forget about AI versus humans. Like, no external person or machine or anything can tell you what you want. And so these specifications you come up with, at least at a high level, they can only be decided by you because, like, what meaning could it possibly have if it doesn't come from you? Um, so AI can't come up with the high level specifications for what you're building. What it can do, and as we talk, I'm going to talk about what I think it can't do, but also what it can do. What it can do is it can help you come up with the lower level specifications. Um, if you have a high level idea of what you want to accomplish, you can tell that to ChatGPT and be like, okay, I have this high level idea, but like help me think of lower level cases. And actually, I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to say this. Um, I want to I want to build a chess program. I'm just making this up right now. I want to build a chess program. Um, I want to build it using a TDD style. Help me come up with some concrete test cases as I start building this program. I'm going to add something to my prompt that I often like to add, which is, by the way, don't make assumptions. Ask me questions about my project in order to give me better answers. So let's see what it comes up with. Sometimes it gives high quality answers and other times it gives lower quality answers. So we'll see what it comes back with. So firstly, it's doing what I wanted it to do, which is it's asking me some clarifying questions about my intents. And even this, as we're talking about TDD, this is like helpful toward that purpose because part of TDD is taking your high level idea and from that high level idea coming up with sufficiently specific low level specifications that you can write tests out of those. So even though we're not specifically talking about tests with ChatGPT right now, this does get us closer to our objective of writing some automated tests. So I'm going to say I want to build I want it to be a web application with a Ruby on Rails backend and Hotwire front end. And I'm going to say, for starters, let's just worry about pawn movement. I don't know if that's a good way to go about it or not, but we'll see what it comes back with. Okay, so this is a great example of one of the points that I want to make. Quite often, ChatGPT will come up with bad test cases. There's two main points I want to make in this talk. One is that AI can't tell you what you want. So that was the first point I was making, that where do specifications come from? They come from you. Like, only you can decide what you want to do with your life. Nobody else can tell you that. And so AI can't tell you what you want to do. Like, AI couldn't tell me that I want to build this chess program, and it can't tell me even it can't even tell me the most high level aspects of it. Like I have to decide, like, do I want this to be an iOS app or do I want it to be a web app or what? Like these high level specifications have to come from me. And chess is maybe a bad example because it's so um, like there's not a huge amount of room for discretion, but most applications for most businesses, there's a huge amount of room for discretion, and that has to be human discretion. So, first point, AI can't tell you what you want, and that is not a fixable problem. It's never going to change. Um, but this other point that ChatGPT often writes poor tests, in principle, that could be fixed. One can imagine an AI that always writes excellent test cases. So this isn't a necessary condition. This is just where the technology happens to be today. And so even though that's a correct statement today that ChatGPT often writes poor tests, if we fast forward 2 years, maybe I will become wrong about that and ChatGPT will be great at it. So I just want to make the distinction that that first one of AI can't tell you what you want, that's never going to change. But the fact that ChatGPT often writes poor test cases, that may well change. I certainly hope it does. Okay, so ChatGPT gave us some like written test cases just in English, and it gave us some actual code. Let's look at this code first. When in initial position, it can move forward 2 squares if unobstructed. Cannot move forward 2 squares if obstructed. Okay, I think this is actually a decent test case. Okay, so I'll make a distinction here between what I think is a poor test case that it gave us and what I think is a better test case that it gave us. So initial pawn movement. Test that a pawn can move forward 2 squares from the initial position. This is, so there's not really like a lot to this. For me, when I'm thinking about specifications, I think about like in scenario A, we get this certain behavior. In scenario B, we get this other behavior. This one of just like the pawn can move forward 2 squares, that's kind of like, that's not interesting behavior. The reason I think this test case is better, these two test cases, is because we're saying under the scenario where there's no obstruction, the pawn can move forward 2 squares. Under the case that there is an obstruction, looks like there's a pawn just ahead of the pawn we're focusing on. It can't move forward. And by the way, this is slightly interesting. I think this pawn placement there's no way that would ever be achieved in chess. So that doesn't really matter, but it's just kind of a funny observation. Let's just take a quick skim of these other test cases it gave us, and evaluate them for quality. This test case is like a good idea, but I think it's like not quite specific enough. Like I would say something more like, here's the starting scenario. The pawn has already moved forward 2 squares. So like it's in position E4 right now, if you know chess. And so from the starting conditions that the pawn is on E4, if the user attempts to drop the pawn onto square E6, nothing happens. And this is actually kind of interesting because this is making me think more deeply about what exactly happens. Um, if a user were to attempt to move a piece to an illegal square, what should happen? Should nothing happen? Should the pawn just move in the direction that you try to move it, but only 1 square instead of the 2 squares that you tried to move it? I think the right thing to happen is just it doesn't move at all. Um, So this is like maybe a good prompt for a test case, but in itself, it doesn't constitute a good test case. It's just not specific enough. And so this is an example that like there's no substitute, again, at least currently, there's no substitute for knowing what you're doing. You have to be quite competent with writing tests before ChatGPT can help you. It's only because I already have quite a bit of testing experience myself that this can be a good prompt. For somebody who has very little testing experience, they might see this and either not know what to do with it, or they might get steered in the wrong direction and create a poor test case because, again, even though this is a decent prompt, it doesn't spell out all the details.
Hey, Jason,
Yeah.
Andy had a question. He said, is there any obvious way to understand why it sometimes gives you good suggestions and why sometimes the suggestions work? Like any in the way you ask the question or what domain you're in? Just anything, any thoughts on that?
I have to ask a question about the question, which is, do you mean, is there a way to manipulate ChatGPT so it gives
So I think Andy,
good and bad
do you want
answer?
to clarify that? I think he was asking that when you said sometimes it gives really good answers and sometimes it gives less good answers on stuff. Um,
I'll just answer both questions.
okay, sounds good.
Um, yeah. So in order to manipulate ChatGPT to give you a higher quality answer, um, it's like equal or greater work to do that than to just go straight to the answer yourself. Again, currently, I can imagine a future where ChatGPT gets better, but currently, my experience is that in order to consistently get good answers out of it, it's just as much, it's just as efficient to just go straight out of your own brain. What was the other way of interpreting that question that I said? Oh yeah, how do you tell the difference between a good and bad test case? Unfortunately, um, that is not simple. Um, that's that's learning the nuances of good and bad test cases over great experience, which is, dozens of little things that go into it. And we've already mentioned some of those. Like, for example, this one here, it's just not specific enough. We want to start with a very specific starting condition and then specify with great specificity what we expect to happen. All right, I'm gonna evaluate this next one here, and we're not gonna go through all these. I just want to give a little sample. Basic forward movement, tested upon can move forward one square. Oh, okay. Yeah, this just describes this apparently. Can move forward one square if the square is unoccupied, cannot move forward one square if the square is occupied. Okay. Tested upon can capture another piece diagonally. I'll comment on this one real quick. For this one, well, there's a pawn on e4, and there's an opponent's knight on d5. And when the user attempts to put that e4 pawn on d5 in order to capture the knight on d5, then the resulting condition is that the knight is no longer on the board and that the pawn now appears in e5, and maybe even other conditions like there's probably some kind of um, there's some kind of area off to the side where you can see the pieces that have been captured. So the test would probably say something about that, and that would be in a separate test case. So again, this is like a decent prompt for a test, but it's nowhere near the degree of specificity that would be needed in order to be useful for somebody who doesn't already really know what they're doing. Okay, I'm going to pause there a second in case anybody has any questions or comments. Okay,
I have a
Yeah.
question real quick. What if
Mhm.
you did it the opposite way? Instead of starting with the spec and telling ChatGPT to write the test, what if you wrote a test and told a series of tests and told ChatGPT to write the code that satisfied all the tests?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. That is something that I'll be getting to very shortly. I'm definitely going to address that, so I'm glad you asked that. Um, I want to mention a couple of the specific ways in which the tests ChatGPT writes tend to fall short, and then I'll touch on what ChatGPT is good for. And Craig, that'll get to your question. Um, ChatGPT often writes tests that are tautological. And a tautology is a statement which is basically circular. It makes a statement that could never not be false. Um, I'm trying to, I've seen, okay, in Ruby on Rails, I've seen a lot of tests where it tests that a model has a certain association with another model. Um, and that's basically it connects one database table with another so that in your Ruby code, you can say such and such dot whatever, and it gets the records from this related table. That's an example of kind of a tautological test where you're testing implementation rather than behavior. It doesn't get you anything to have that test. Better to write a test for the behavior that that association enables in this example rather than to test the association itself. So ChatGPT will often write tests that are tautological or that test implementation rather than behavior, or tests that are just really not at the right level of abstraction. So maybe you're in a scenario where it's appropriate to write a system test, a test that exercises the whole stack, browser, database, all that stuff. Maybe it's appropriate to write that kind of test, but instead ChatGPT writes a really low-level unit test. Or maybe it's the other way around where you want to write a unit test, or maybe you don't know, but you should be writing a unit test, and ChatGPT suggests that you write a system test. And if you don't know any better, you might say, oh, okay, I'll do that because ChatGPT suggested it. So those are some specific ways in which ChatGPT can write poor tests.
So those both are interesting because when working with teams, they're trying to start using TDD. Both of those things are exactly the things that people do. So it I'm curious. I'm wondering if it's training material. It's all based on
Yeah.
that. So
Yeah. I've thought the exact same thing. Like, um, I don't have a deep understanding of how LLMs work, but I understand that there's a strong statistical component to it. And so it goes out into the world and it sees all these examples and it's like, well, this is the way everybody's doing it, so this must be the way to do it. And sadly, the examples of tests that are out there in the world are not always great. And so it adopts what's popular, not necessarily what's actually sound thinking. Again, hopefully ChatGPT gets smarter in the future and we can rely on it more. So if it's not good for those things, what is it good for? One thing that I find it really good for is um, when you know what you want to do, but you don't know syntactically exactly how you want to do it. So here's an example I'll give of that. Um, I'll say this. I have an HTML grid. I'm just making stuff up. I have an HTML grid that represents my chessboard. Using Capybara, I want to click on the E4 position of the board. How can I do this? This might actually turn out to be a bad example, but let's see what it comes back with. The reason I say it might be a bad example is because it's too hypothetical and high level, but we'll see. Okay, so it's giving me a suggestion for how to formulate my HTML and then how to write my test in such a way that matches. That's fine. That is helpful. That's not exactly the kind of example I wanted to give. Let me give a different example. I'm going to use this actual HTML page as an example. So I'm going to say, like, how do I click on this element here? Okay, so I'm going to copy this element here. So I'm going to copy this outer element. I will paste this HTML in here. And then I'll say, using Capybara, I want to click on, let's pick something that we want to click on. Let's say this visit line. Yeah. I want to click on this line. How can I do it? And I don't know if this will give a good answer or not a great answer, but my experience is usually with these sorts of things, ChatGPT gives a good answer enough of a percentage of a time that it's worth at least trying. So let's see what it says here. Okay, well, that's kind of underwhelming. But anyway, my point that I want to convey is that when you know what test case you want to write, but you don't know like physically how to make it happen, ChatGPT can definitely help with that kind of stuff. And the other thing I want to mention is that ChatGPT can do a pretty good job of writing code to make tests pass. So let me see. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second because I want to bring up some code here, and I don't want to accidentally share something that I shouldn't. Okay, now I'm going to reshare.
Don't want to share his chat that's going on with the NSA and all those things.
Exactly.
Hey, I want to ask clarification on what you were just saying. That was I understand correctly that you're saying ChatGPT, if you say here's what I want to test, it often can be good at giving you the semantics, like, how do I actually do this with these tools if you tell it exactly what you're trying to check for?
Yeah. And as I think about this a little more deeply, it's like that stuff is very like objective and yeah, it's just very objective. Like, how do I get my hands on this DOM element using Capybara? Like, that's just very objective. It's not like the testing stuff, which is it's not exactly that it's subjective, it's just much more nuanced and requires more judgment. Yeah, maybe that's the thing. It's objective and doesn't require judgment. Like there's exactly one right, either it works or it doesn't.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask ChatGPT to write me a test. Write me an RSpec test for some super simple thing. We'll see what it comes back with. So I'm gonna grab this test and then I'm gonna run it and then I'm gonna ask ChatGPT to write the code to make it pass. Okay, and for extra simplicity, I'm just gonna even copy that part. Okay, bank accounts backtype RB. So I'm gonna run rspec bank account spec.rb. Okay. and I'm getting an error about a database, which is fascinating because, oh, here we go. ChatGPT steered me wrong. It said require Rails helper. I never said anything about Rails. I wanted a Ruby test, but I never said I was using Rails. So let's run that again without that. Okay, now we get something which is more like what I would expect. So I'm going to give ChatGPT my test code. Whoops, I hit enter prematurely. I'm going to give it my test code, and then I'm going to copy and paste this output. And ChatGPT is smart enough to infer what I want. I don't even have to say anything, and it will help solve my problem. Okay, so it says I'm getting that error uninitialized constant bank account because there is no bank account class. Andy said in the chat, I thought you did mention Rails 10 minutes ago. I did mention Rails, but that was for an entirely different program. I don't know. I guess it's kind of fair that it assumed I wanted Rails. Okay. So ChatGPT is giving me some code to make my tests pass, but it's doing me wrong again. It's writing more code than necessary. It's coding speculatively. In TDD, we only want to write enough code to make the current error message go away, because otherwise we risk writing code speculatively that is not covered by our tests, and it's neither tested nor is necessary for a program to function. So that's bad. So I'm going to say only give me the bare minimum amount of code to make the current failure message go away. And so what it should give me is just an empty bank account class. Let's see if it does. Okay. So I'll do that. Okay, and it's assuming there's a bank account file called bankaccount.rb. I guess I'll do that. It didn't really give me the full answer. So see, it's just not doing great yet. Hopefully it gets smarter in the future, but as of now, it's not doing great. So it says undefined method balance. So I will give it this, and I'll give it this, and I'll give it this. And since it needs to be told, I'll say only give me enough code to make the current failure message go away. And then after this, we'll wrap up and transition to Q&A. Okay, it did a better job there. It said, it just gave me this method without any real definition. Arguably, it shouldn't even have given the 0. Okay. Now I could say like, add just one more small test case and it'll help me. And this workflow kind of works. Emphasis on kind of, because it like depends on me knowing how to guide it. Like it depends on me knowing what tests to tell it to write. And then it depends on me catching it when it misbehaves. And I've done kind of a lot of this kind of work just to like test drive this workflow and see how viable it is. And sadly, my conclusion is that in the current state, this workflow is just not that viable. I would love to get to the point, and I can certainly imagine this future where I'm doing like a screen share with AI, and I'm saying, all right, you're my pair programmer. I want to be able to just verbally dictate, like, give me a new test case, and it shows me something, and I say like, good, that one's great. Put that in there, and I can just like watch it, write a test, write the code to make it pass, write another test, etc. And I'm just kind of supervising and verbally saying, that's good. Okay, wait, stop there. I want to do this different thing. And it's just like very light touch, high level oversight that I'm giving. That would be great, but the technology is just not there yet. Okay, so that concludes my prepared portion. And just to drive it home, 2 points. One is that AI can't tell you what you want. That's never going to change. And two is that right now, ChatGPT often writes poor quality tests, and that is, in principle at least, a fixable problem, and I expect that to improve. Okay, so I'm going to look at the questions.
We've got a few questions here. I put a link there. Feel free to, if you've got questions you want to see answered, you can put things there and vote them up and down. One thing that kind of struck me as you're working on this, Jason, is ChatGPT is usually trained on completed programs. I don't think it's trained on the iterations that programs go through. So like the idea of something simple. So I'm wondering if you had large language models that were trained on actually the evolution of code, if you'd end up with something that looks very, very different and maybe a whole lot more useful.
That's a really interesting thought. I've never thought about it from that angle before. Some of the stuff is hard. I've been reading a couple books lately by David Deutsch called The Fabric of Reality was one, and the other one is The Beginning of Infinity. And in these books, he talks about inductivism, the idea that in order to make scientific progress, scientists make observations in the world, and they use inductive reasoning to say like, oh, there's all these facts, and so based on all these facts, we like weight certain ideas and we draw conclusions from that. For example, the sun rose, and then the next day the sun rose again, the next day the sun rose again. And so every day that the sun rises, we add more weight to the idea that the sun is going to rise every day. And we reason that the future will resemble the past. And because the sun has risen every day so far, we can predict with strong confidence that it'll rise tomorrow. But that way of thinking is actually false. That's not how scientific progress works. Instead, we have explanations. We know the sun is going to rise tomorrow because we have an explanation of how the solar system works and the Earth's rotation. And that's how we know. I bring up all that because if it's true that LLMs work statistically by looking at examples, then we have this problem that it'll give more weight to things that it sees more commonly. And in programming, I find that quite often the things that are most common are the most wrong. And people with sound thinking in programming are sadly quite rare. And so what does that mean for training LLMs for programming? Somehow we're going to have to give we're going to have to give AI the ability to reason based on explanations rather than just statistics, and say this is a good idea because of this good explanation, and even though it's a minority opinion, it's right because it has a sound explanation. So I don't know, I'm not an AI engineer or anything like that, so who knows? But to me, it seems like that's going to have to be addressed in order for that to happen.
And if that is true, it also means that as more people use AI as part of their coding, we may have a very dangerous spiral downward where there's more and more code that does the same thing, that has the same issues with it, which trains more. That's an interesting thought. Okay, so question here. Have you had ChatGPT do anything that was dangerous in code? Laura was mentioning something where a company shut down because somebody used something and it introduced an injection attack. So just curious if you'd seen anything like that.
Yeah, no. I can't even recall anything that ChatGPT has suggested to me that appeared dangerous. But like I won't mince words. Taking code from ChatGPT and just copy pasting it uncritically into a code base and then allowing that code to make it to production is just idiotic. Um, like when would you ever take code from a human contributor and just say, oh, this contractor from somewhere who we haven't vetted at all, let's just take his code in one big chunk and not even scrutinize it. We just put it into the code base and ship it off to production. Like that's crazy. If you wouldn't do that with a human, so why would you do that with ChatGPT? And I didn't think that anybody would be dumb enough to do that. But what I found is that people are. So yeah, I didn't think it needed to be said, but like, don't do that.
Okay, next question. If you were coding something for your own business, what type of things would you use ChatGPT for? Or would you use it at all for if you were like working on a project just for yourself?
It's a really interesting question.
And I think the intent is if you weren't doing it to learn about ChatGPT.
Yeah. I mean, I think the answer is the same as the answer for what I would use it, what I already use it for, which is like I use it for the low level, objective, um, um, challenges that don't require a lot of discretion and judgment and that kind of stuff. Things where there's like one or two right ways to do something, or it works or it doesn't, that kind of thing. I found AI to be great for that stuff. Um, Things where it requires more discretion or judgment or stuff like that, I think you just have to rely on yourself. And I do use ChatGPT for like high level stuff, like that chess example, like that was a real example of how I might use ChatGPT, but that's only very much a starting point. And then I apply my own scrutiny to what ChatGPT says to me. I don't just take it and say like, "Oh, you said I should do this. I guess I'll just do that." There's no shortcuts to if you use it as a shortcut to bridge a skill gap, it's going to come back and bite you almost certainly. So it can't be a real replacement for skill. It can only give you ideas and it can give you like that really low level help when things don't require judgment.
Okay, Satish asked, when talking about ChatGPT, why is it limited? Why is it limited unit testing? Is it because ChatGPT carries limited amount of context?
Hmm. I have to say I don't completely understand the question.
Yeah, Satish, do you want to just hop on and explain what you're asking there? I don't think I quite caught everything either. I think there's probably a lot here that I missed. Let's see. You on there?
Maybe we can come back around to that one.
Yeah, yeah. So next question, but I would like to hear what you were saying, Satish, if you're still on, because that sounds interesting. Is there any knowledge of applying ChatGPT to real-time code or RTOS systems or RTOS software? Um,
Hmm. I don't know what real-time code is, nor do I know what RTOS software is.
are, yeah, are we talking about like real-time system, meaning like embedded systems where things have to happen instantaneously? Real-time operating systems. Okay. So maybe things where you're dealing with control systems that have to happen instantaneously or as fast and close to instantaneous. Do you have any experience in that area?
No. Yeah, that's an easy one for me to answer. My answer is I don't know. I have no idea.
I would assume that it probably has something to do with how much code is available of those types of systems within whatever it was trained on.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into that next question. Are there any languages that ChatGPT does better or worse with? The more examples that are out there, the better it does. The fewer, the worse. That's been my experience.
Okay. One thing I've found kind of interesting is I've been doing a lot of stuff with Racket, and Racket is very well documented, but there's not as much just code out there. And I haven't found a language model that does a good job of understanding the documentation.
Mm.
So there's lots of stuff where you get into it, and it will very confidently tell you how to do something that turns out, and this, some of this has to do with just the way Lisp languages work, but very confidently show you how to do something that only works in certain circumstances if you've got this other language thing happening and stuff. But it seems very, it, I've seen the stuff you do, and I've seen what results I get from Racket. It doesn't look anything like what you're doing. So some of that's because there's not as much, but I think also it's because most people using that are using the documentation more than they're finding examples of code, which is probably the place that the LLMs are worst at being able to do.
Interesting.
Let's see. Let's see if Satish had a. Don't think he had. Andy asked about self-modifying code related to the real-time system thing, which is an interesting idea. Let's see, and I don't see anything else from Satish there. So I think I'm going to, Satish, I'm going to just make up stuff that you might have meant until unless you're able to say. But so what is the idea of using it for creating tests and then having it filled out? Why does that seem to work well for ChatGPT versus just saying, here's what I want you to do?
Sorry, this is the difference between saying to ChatGPT, here's what I want you to do, and what
Well,
was
like
the
in
other one?
the example you gave was you got a test, whether it created it or you created it, and then you said, here's the test, here's the output I'm getting. Give me help me write the code to make this test pass.
Mm-hmm.
And I, if I understood you correctly, it sounded like you were getting better results from that than just saying, give me
Yeah,
something that. Why is that? What's your experience been in that area?
I think it's because there's less judgment required. If you think about writing a test, it's kind of from a blank canvas. But if you're taking an existing test and writing the code to make it pass, that's like an existing target that you have to hit. So it's like creating a work of art on a blank canvas versus hitting an objective target that already exists. It's much better at the latter.
Okay. And I would think also it gives you as the human involved in the conversation, we'll call it that. It also gives you a way to get a feedback loop going, right? And if you're just saying do this, and then you've got to dig in and try to figure out if it did what you wanted or not. Now, if you've got something that actually produces an error message that you can give back to it, it seems like that would be it gives you a cycle of saying, here's what it gave me. Now what do I do?
Yeah. And even though it's true that we're not yet ready for my dream scenario where you can just ask AI to write the test and then write the code to make it pass and then just repeat that until it's done. I think we can get to something like that, but we're not there yet. Even though we're not there yet, I certainly do find myself occasionally getting into a similar scenario where I have an error with a test. I'm not sure how to handle it. And I say, hey, ChatGPT, here's my test code. Here's my application code. Here's the error I'm getting. Help me figure out like what's going on here. I have found that to be genuinely useful.
Hey, Jason, I'm off mute. Uh,
Oh yeah.
Mark, can I go? Can I go next? Okay. So the question I was asking is, when we hear or even read about ChatGPT, we primarily talk about, listen about unit testing. So the question is, it is limited to smaller chunks of code, smaller functions that we want to be evaluated with different permutations. Is it limited to just unit testing as opposed to more context-driven functional testing where the before state and after state are much more relevant, including the current test scenario?
Mm. No, it can certainly help with the higher level tests too. And actually, I found it can often be more helpful with the higher level tests, just because with the higher level tests, there's often more setup involved, and there's more like, think about all the browser manipulation syntax that you have to use. There's potentially a lot more friction between the idea you have of what you want to do and the syntax that you need to write in order to make that happen. So there's a lot more opportunity for ChatGPT to remove that friction and to just say like, okay, I know what you're trying to do. Here's the syntax to make that happen. Does that address your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Cool. I'll
Okay.
have to go back and watch the video to see that question because something just happened. I don't know if we had a storm, but I just lost power and had to come back up here. But I think we're at time. Was there anybody else that had one last thing they wanted to ask?
I'll go next. Are we building on this conversation another time, Mark? This is a very interesting topic.
Would you like to hear more about this?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So one thing I want to mention, Jason has a Code with Jason session he does that gets into some really interesting topics. It's usually a group of people where you're either, well, actually, why don't you just tell everybody about it and let's make sure everybody knows about that because I think there may be some people very interested in that.
Yeah, sure. It is similar to this. It's called the Code with Jason meetup, and I run it twice a week. It happens on Wednesday evenings Eastern time, and then on Sunday mornings Eastern time also. The Sunday morning ones are for people in like European, Asian time zones, that kind of thing. And every week I either do some live coding or I'll have like a mentee come on and we'll talk about something. I'll help them with a project, something like that. Sometimes we just have a discussion. And if you're interested in checking that out, you can go to codewithjason.com and you can find the info on how to join there.
And I put the link there, so check that out if you want to. And Satish, that we'll see if we can get some more topics on this too, if it sounds like things that people are interested in. But Jason, thank you so much. I always learn a lot whenever chatting with you, so I appreciate you taking the time to do this. This was very interesting, and yeah, thanks for making time to talk to us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And a couple things just mentioned to everybody as you leave. We've got next week we're going to be talking about leading Agile Part 2. So that's coming up. If you weren't there for Part 1, it's self-contained enough. It will be interested. You may find it interesting even if you weren't able to make the first one. The other thing for people in the Kansas City area, DevOps Days is coming up. If you're interested in going, let me know. I've got a key code. My son and I are speaking at it, and I've got a key code that will give you a discount on it. So if you reach out, I'll send that over to you. So thank you, everybody, and hope to see you next week.